Rachel got Alex ready for their usual walk. They decided to head to Wimbledon Common, a large, open expanse of nature not far from their home. The park was beautiful, full of fields, footpaths, trees, a few streams, even a pond. It was the kind of place that on most warm summer days would be brimming with people, families with picnic blankets, children running barefoot through the grass, couples lying back under the sun. But this particular day was quieter. It was a weekday morning. Most people were at work. Kids were in school. That day there were only about 500 people scattered across the vast common. And while that sounds like a lot, in a space as large as Wimbledon Common, it could feel almost empty. Still, nothing about that morning felt unusual. Rachel and Alex walked together, following their familiar paths. They made their way toward a more wooded part of the park, an area shaded by trees, quieter, more secluded. Rachel, ever the cautious mother, wouldn't have led her son somewhere she thought was dangerous. Yes, it was more covered. Yes, there weren't people immediately nearby. But it was still broad daylight. The sun was shining. There were people in the park, just not in that particular patch. To Rachel, it didn't feel unsafe. It was peaceful. It was calm. Until, suddenly, it wasn't. Something shifted. An instinct. A gut feeling. Rachel felt at first a sinking sensation in her stomach. And then, strangely, so did Alex. At just 2 years old, he may not have been able to explain it, but he felt it too. The air changed. Something was wrong. They both turned their heads, looking to the right, and there he was. A large man, emerging from the bushes, carrying a black bag slung over his shoulder. He was running straight at them. It all happened in seconds. A moment of recognition, and then chaos. Rachel and her son had no time to react, no time to run. One moment they were walking together in the stillness of morning, and the next, they were under attack. What happened next was sudden, brutal, incomprehensible. As Rachel and Alex stood there, caught in that awful instant of realization, the man charged. And the first thing he did before Rachel could even move was grab little Alex. This stranger, this man bursting from the bushes, reached down and seized the 2-year-old child and threw him violently to the ground. He didn't harm him directly after that. Not physically, at least. But the act itself, the aggression, the force, was enough to cause pain. The impact alone would have stunned and frightened any child. It was violent, jarring, and it left Alex on the ground, dazed. But the man's attention wasn't on him anymore. Once the child was out of the way, his focus shifted entirely to Rachel. In the space of a breath, he pulled a knife from his pocket. Before she could even cry out, before she could run, before she could shield herself, he came up from behind her and reached around her neck. And then he slashed her throat. Rachel collapsed to her knees, but he wasn't done. He began stabbing her over and over and over again. Each movement is cruel, relentless, without mercy. The attack was frenzied, silent. There was no time for her to scream, no chance for help to arrive. Just moments before, she had been walking peacefully with her child, and now she was dying. Alone, in the dirt. When it was over, Rachel fell beside her son just feet from where Alex was beginning to pick himself up from the ground. He turned, and he saw her. She was lying still, not far from him. Her body, her face, her presence, no longer full of life, but still somehow peaceful. Years later, Alex would recall that moment. The sight of his mother lying next to him. He didn't understand what had just happened. He was just a baby, but he remembered how peaceful she looked, as if she was simply sleeping. As if the horror she had just endured had somehow passed her by. She looked at rest. He didn't see a murdered woman. He saw his mother taking a nap in the grass. The horror of it all was not only in what happened, but in who saw it, because Alex had witnessed it, all of it. This child, barely 3 years old, had just watched his mother's life being stolen from her. And the man who had done it, he didn't run, he didn't scream, he didn't panic. Instead, after the attack, Alex watched him calmly walk over to a nearby stream. The man crouched down, dipped his hands into the water, and began to wash them clean, blood trickling from his fingers, staining the stream with a quiet red. He was calm, composed, as if none of it had happened, as if Rachel wasn't lying just a few feet away. Her life was gone. When he was finished, he stood up and walked away. No rush, no fear, just walked. And Alex, still confused, still trying to make sense of the impossible, turned back to his mother. At 2 years old, he didn't yet understand death. He didn't know what it meant to lose someone. He couldn't comprehend that his mother was gone, truly gone. So he did what any child might do. He walked over to her, knelt down beside her body, and tugged at her arm. "Wake up, Mommy," he said. "Come on, wake up." But she didn't move. She never would again. In that moment, something inside him shifted. He still didn't fully understand death. How could he? But he understood something. He understood that she wasn't coming back. And that's how Rachel Nichols' life ended violently, senselessly, in broad daylight, in a park where she had simply taken her child and her dog for a walk. And that's how Alexander's life changed forever, in seconds, in silence, in the stillness of his mother's final breath. About 10 minutes after the attack, as the sun continued to shine softly over Wimbledon Common, an older gentleman named Michael Murray was walking through the wooded area where Rachel and her son had been just moments before. It was a peaceful stroll, just an ordinary morning. Nothing about his walk felt out of the ordinary until he noticed something. At first, it was just a glimpse. The pale shape of legs, bare, protruding into the path ahead of him. He paused. His mind didn't jump immediately to horror. In fact, his first thought was something far more innocent. Maybe someone was sunbathing. People did that all the time on Wimbledon Common, especially on warm summer days like this. It was a popular place to relax, after all. But as he walked closer, the scene before him shifted from curious to incomprehensible. What he saw wasn't someone sunbathing. It was Rachel. Her body was half-dressed. There was blood, so much blood, and her eyes, he later said, had a glazed, stony look, lifeless, cold. In that instant, he knew. This woman was not asleep. She was gone. And standing beside her, still there, still frozen in place, was Alex. The 2-year-old boy was tugging on his mother's arm, whispering in that soft, innocent voice only children have. "Come on, Mummy. Wake up." That was the moment the weight of the tragedy settled. A life had been lost brutally, but what was left behind was perhaps even more devastating. A child who could not yet understand that the woman who loved him most in this world would never wake again. Michael Murray called emergency services, paramedics, police. The whole response arrived quickly and urgently at Wimbledon Common. Officers secured the scene. Medics assessed the situation. But in the midst of all the chaos, all the movement and radio chatter and flashing lights, there was Alex, a toddler, surrounded by strangers, in the middle of something no child should ever witness. After everything he'd seen, everything he'd stood through, the decision was made to sedate him. It wasn't an easy call. He was just 2 years old. But the authorities understood that he was vulnerable mentally, emotionally, physically. What he had witnessed was beyond trauma. They didn't want him to be frightened in a backseat surrounded by strangers. They didn't want him to feel abandoned in the confusion. They just needed him to be somewhere calm, away from the overwhelming nightmare still unfolding around him, until they could speak to psychologists, until his father arrived, until someone could hold him in a way that made him feel safe again. So they sedated him, gently, carefully. And Alex was taken to the nearest hospital away from the field, away from his mother's body, away from the chaos. Meanwhile, back on the common, the scene was being sealed. Police officers stretched tape across the grounds. A perimeter was formed. Investigators and forensics teams arrived swiftly. This wasn't just an attack. This was a public murder in a well-known park in London. And every detail mattered now. They examined Rachel's body, noting the injuries, the position, the location of the wounds. It became quickly clear that she had likely been attacked from behind. The deep cut across her throat suggested it, and many of the stab wounds were clustered around her back and side. That detail, while horrifying, was also revealing because it meant something else. It meant the killer probably wasn't covered in blood. As grotesque as it sounds, wounds in the back tend to bleed less outwardly than wounds to the front of the body. Most of the blood would have stayed on Rachel, not sprayed onto her attacker, which meant the man who had just carried out a frenzied, brutal stabbing, the kind that should have left him soaked in red, may have been able to walk away looking ordinary. And that's exactly what he did. Washed his hands in the stream, stood up, walked away. That man vanished into the public without a second glance from anyone. No one stopped him. No one suspected him. In a park that still had hundreds of people in it, this man had just murdered someone in cold blood and disappeared as if nothing had happened. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He just left. And for now, there were no answers. Only a field marked with police tape, a mother gone far too soon, and a little boy sedated in a hospital bed, his world forever shattered before he even knew what death truly meant. From the very beginning, when investigators arrived at the scene and saw Rachel's body, one devastating conclusion began to take shape. She had been found partially undressed, and the way her clothing was disturbed, the positioning of her body, it suggested something far worse than a random act of violence. It appeared she had been sexually assaulted. Exactly when that assault occurred remains uncertain. There are still questions. There are still gaps haunting, silent moments that may never be fully explained. One of the questions that lingers, particularly in the minds of those who try to piece this together, is whether Alex had lost consciousness during the attack. He had been thrown to the ground violently, and while there's no confirmation that he blacked out, it's something that's quietly wondered, because his memory of the event is strangely fractured. What Alex remembered, years later, was being thrown, and then, suddenly, his mother was gone. The man was at the stream, washing his hands. It was as if the middle part, the worst part, was missing, a blank space. Was it the trauma? Or something more physical, a concussion, perhaps? No one can say for sure. But the horror of what happened to Rachel seems to have played out largely without her son seeing it, and in some twisted way, maybe that was mercy. Later, the autopsy confirmed what had been suspected. Rachel had indeed been sexually assaulted, and she had been stabbed 49 times. 49 wounds, a number so high it feels unreal. So much violence, so much rage. And it all happened in a matter of moments. The attack had been fast, frenzied, but even so, to stab someone 49 times takes time. This wasn't over in a flash. Rachel had been subjected to a prolonged, relentless assault. Some of the injuries were concentrated on her hands and arms, classic signs of self-defense. It meant Rachel had fought back. She hadn't surrendered easily. She had tried desperately to protect herself, to survive, to live. Even in her final seconds, she resisted. But in the end, it was the slash to her neck that took her life. That wound was catastrophic. It was so deep, the coroner noted, it had nearly decapitated her. One final, irreversible blow. And even after death, the story didn't stop. At the crime scene, Rachel's pockets were found to be strangely arranged, her belongings, little items, spilled out around her. At first, it was assumed this was the result of the struggle. After all, it had been chaotic, wild. Her things likely flew from her clothes as she fought for her life. But it was something else. Something more human. Because later, as police reconstructed the scene, they learned something heartbreaking. It was Alex. After the attacker left, after Rachel lay still in the dirt, her little boy had walked around, picking up her things, piece by piece. He gathered them, gently, and placed them back into her pockets. As if tidying up, as if helping, as if taking care of his mum. A cash machine receipt was also found, strangely, on Rachel's forehead. At first, it puzzled officers. It seemed so deliberate, so oddly placed. It didn't make sense. Until they spoke to Alex, and he told them he had found the receipt nearby. And in his innocent little heart, in the way that children try to fix things they don't understand, he thought it might help her. He thought it was like a plaster, a Band-Aid, something that could make her better. So he placed it on her forehead to help her heal. His exact words? To make Mummy better. A child's instinct. Pure. Tragic. Utterly crushing. This boy, 2 years old, had just watched his world collapse, in a way no child ever should. And he responded the only way he knew how. He tried to help. He tried to put her things back where they belonged. He tried to comfort her with a scrap of paper. He tried to undo the unthinkable. And then he waited, alone, for over 10 minutes, sitting beside her body, tugging at her arm, placing a receipt on her head, saying again and again, "Wake up, Mummy." There are few things in this world more heartbreaking than that. When it came to physical evidence at the crime scene, there really wasn't much. This was 1,992. Forensic science, at least the kind we rely on now, advanced DNA profiling, digital crime scene reconstruction, wasn't something police could turn to at the time. Investigators still had to depend on the basics: visible evidence, eyewitness accounts, physical clues that could be seen, touched, and gathered. So they searched. They scoured the entire wooded area of Wimbledon Common, hoping to find something, anything that might have been left behind. A weapon, a scrap of clothing, a personal item dropped in the rush. But there was nothing. No knife, no personal effects, no clear, immediate trace of the man who had committed this horrific act. What they did find was small, almost frustratingly small. A tiny fragment believed to be DNA that was far too limited in quantity for 1,992 technology to test. Back then, DNA had to be collected in larger amounts, and the equipment to process microsamples simply didn't exist. Still, they preserved it, carefully, quietly, hoping that someday, somehow, technology would catch up. But for the moment, it was all but useless. There was also a partial footprint in the mud. It wasn't much, just a faint impression, but investigators believed it might have belonged to the killer. A fleeting clue, a ghost of a step in the dirt, and then something strange. In Alex's hair, they found small flecks of red paint. Investigators noted it, unsure if it was significant. There was no immediate link to anything, no explanation. It could have meant something or nothing at all. At this stage, everything was a question mark. With so little to work with, no weapon, no clear DNA, no eyewitnesses, the police knew that this investigation would have to lean heavily on something else. People, witnesses, recollections. The hope that someone, somewhere on the common that morning, might have seen something even if they didn't know it yet. So they moved quickly. Wimbledon Common was locked down. No one was allowed to leave. Officers moved through the grounds, stopping every person still on the field. They took names, phone numbers, addresses. They asked for brief descriptions, height, clothing, movements, anything that might help. They conducted quick, unofficial interviews on the spot. Did you see anyone running? Did you notice someone strange in the wooded area? Did anything feel off this morning? But again, nothing. No one had seen the man. No one had noticed anything strange. It was as if he had melted into the trees. The only witness to Rachel Nichols' murder was her 2-year-old son. By now, a few hours had passed since the first emergency call. The sun had risen higher. The park was still sealed off. The crime scene still humming with quiet urgency. Officers, forensics teams, and medics worked under the looming shadow of unanswered questions. But now came the most painful task of all. Someone had to tell Andre. Rachel's partner, the father of her child, Andre Hanscom, was still working. He was out on his motorcycle, making deliveries across London. He didn't know. He had no idea that while he was weaving through city traffic, wearing his helmet, making stops, his life had already changed forever. It took some time for the police to reach him, but eventually they caught him during one of his breaks. Like many couriers, Andre would stop by the flat between jobs to use the bathroom, grab a snack, reset for the next leg of the day. That's where they got him. The house phone rang. Andre picked it up, and before the person on the other end could even say much, Andre knew. He didn't recognize the voice. But something about it, the tone, the weight, the hollow stillness in it, told him everything. It was official, formal. It was sad. It was final. He didn't know yet what had happened, but he knew it was bad. His heart knew. His instincts screamed. There was no ordinary reason a call like this would come through. No ordinary voice that would carry such quiet devastation. In that moment, before the words were even spoken, Andre felt his world tilt. And soon, he would hear it. Rachel, his partner, his love, the mother of his son, gone. When the phone rang, Andre answered, expecting nothing more than a quick check-in, a routine interruption in the middle of his courier route. But the moment he heard the voice on the other end, something inside him shifted. It was a man, a stranger, calm, low, and controlled. But the weight in his voice, the carefulness, the absence of detail, it was all wrong. "This is about Rachel," the officer said. "Something's happened." Andre froze. "What do you mean something's happened? What's going on?" he asked, heart racing. "I can't explain it over the phone," the man said. "I need you to come down to the station so we can talk about it properly." Andre felt his stomach drop. He pressed harder. "Number no, please. Just tell me. What's happened to Rachel?" But the man stayed firm. "I really can't, sir. I'm asking you to come to the station. We'll talk then." And that's when Andre lost control, not out of rage, but out of fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. He shouted down the line, voice cracking, heart unraveling. "She's dead, isn't she? That's why you won't say anything. Because if it was anything else, if she was injured or in trouble, you'd just tell me. But you're not. Because she's gone. Just say it. She's dead, isn't she?" There was a pause on the other end. And then, quietly, the officer said again, "I'm sorry. I can't tell you anything on the phone. Please come to the station." But that pause said everything. Andre knew. He didn't need the words. They had already been spoken between the lines. The silence, the sorrow, the restraint. It all told him what he already feared with every cell in his body. Rachel was gone. And then came the next question, the one that came straight from the instinct of a father. "Where's Alex?" Andre asked. "Is he okay? Where is he?" "He's safe," the officer said. "He's at the hospital. He's okay. Please, come to the station." Andre's knees buckled. He collapsed right there in his own home. It was too much, too fast, too final. The woman he loved, the woman he had built his life around, was dead. And his child, their son, was alone in a hospital after witnessing the unthinkable. Eventually, he pulled himself up. Somehow. He didn't remember how. He just moved. One foot after the other. He made his way to the station. There, officers gave him only the briefest explanation. There would be questions later. Statements. Reports. But that could wait. Because all Andre wanted, all he needed, was to see his son. Police allowed him to go to the hospital. And as he sat in the car, being driven to the place where his little boy waited, his thoughts went to dark and desperate places. He didn't want to live. Not without Rachel. And he didn't want Alex to live either. Not with this. Not with the trauma of what he had seen. Not with this unbearable memory replaying in his mind for the rest of his life. Rachel and Alex had always shared something profound, a bond that felt unbreakable, like soulmates. Not in the romantic sense, but in the truest emotional way. As if their spirits had been designed to be together. Now, that bond had been torn apart. Andre couldn't imagine how Alex could survive without her. So during that drive, he began to think of ways to end it. For both of them. He didn't want to make the decision alone. He wanted to find a way to ask Alex, to understand if his son even wanted to go on. In a way, he thought, he'd let his son decide. It's haunting. It's terrifying. But in the moment, it was the only kind of logic Andre could find through the fog of his grief. When he arrived at the hospital, he was stopped before he could see Alex. A child psychiatrist sat him down. They needed to talk. They needed to prepare him. This conversation, this first moment between father and son, would shape how Alex processed the rest of his life. The trauma he'd endured couldn't be undone, but it could be approached with care, with intention, with the right words. They told Andre that he needed to be gentle, but honest. that there could be no confusion, that Alex couldn't be left clinging to false hope. He needed to understand that his mother was gone completely, so that his mind didn't fill the silence with illusions. Because that kind of hope can be cruel. The weight of that moment to have to explain death to a 2-year-old is something no parent is ever prepared for. But Andre had no choice. He was the only one who could walk into that room and give Alex even a sliver of comfort. Eventually, the sedation began to wear off, and Alex slowly woke up. He blinked into the light of the hospital room, groggy, confused. The world had changed around him, but his heart still belonged to the one he loved most. The very first thing he said when he saw his father, "Where's Mummy? Where's the dog? Where's Molly?" Even after all he'd been through being thrown to the ground, watching his mother fall, left alone beside her body, his thoughts weren't about himself. He didn't talk about the pain or the fear. He didn't talk about the man or the knife. He wanted to know where his family was. Andre tried to hold it together. He sat by his son's bedside, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to answer as gently as he could. But it was clear that something in Alex had already changed. He was so quiet, withdrawn. He barely spoke, aside from repeating those same questions. Where was Mummy? Where was Molly? And so, with the weight of the moment sitting heavily on his shoulders, Andre told him the truth. He looked into his son's eyes, this child who still smelled like innocence, and told him that Mummy was gone, that she wasn't coming back. There was no way to soften it. There were no better words. Rachel's absence was already a presence in the room, and there wasn't much else Andre could say that Alex hadn't already seen for himself. From that point on, it was just the two of them, father and son. By lunchtime that same day, mere hours after the murder, the story was already everywhere. Front-page news. A tragedy unlike anything the British public had heard in years. A young mother, sexually assaulted and stabbed to death in broad daylight while her 2-year-old son watched. It shook the country. It devastated people. But what came next wasn't compassion. It was frenzy. Reporters descended on Wimbledon Common. They filled the park within hours of Rachel's death, setting up cameras, whispering into microphones, trying to capture every angle of grief. But that wasn't the worst of it. They found out where Alex was. They found the hospital. And they showed up. Photographers, journalists, crews with lights and tripods and long lenses crowding outside a building where a toddler was recovering from the worst thing imaginable. They were trying to get a photo of him, of Andre, maybe even an interview. A 2-year-old. Just hours after watching his mother die, police had to lock the hospital down. Literally, no one in, no one out. Officers stood guard at entrances because journalists grown adults were trying to sneak in to catch a glimpse, trying to force a tragedy into a headline. Andre, stunned and grieving, couldn't take his son home. Not to that house, the house where Rachel's voice still lived in the walls. So that night, they went to stay with Andre's parents. And as the house settled into a cold silence, Andre lay next to his son. The boy was staring at the ceiling, still and sad, his little body so small in the bed. Andre had been thinking all day. He couldn't stop. He didn't want to go on without Rachel. He didn't want Alex to live with the memories of that morning, images that could haunt him for a lifetime. The thought of watching his son grow up with trauma in his eyes, it was unbearable. But he wasn't going to do anything without knowing what Alex wanted. So he lay down beside his son, and he gave him an analogy. He said, "One day, Molly's going to get very old. She'll be tired, she might be sick, and she'll just want to sleep forever. She won't want to wake up anymore." It was quiet for a moment. And then, Alex turned his head. He looked into his father's eyes, and in that innocent, clear voice he said, "I would want to wake up." Andre's heart broke all over again. But at that moment, he knew his son wanted to live, and if Alex was going to keep going, then so would he. They would carry on, together, for Rachel, for each other. So much hinged on that moment in the dark. When Alex looked up at his father and said he wanted to wake up, he wasn't just choosing life for himself. Without even realizing it, he was choosing life for both of them. That simple, innocent response saved them. From there, The world kept turning. But for Andre, for Alex, and for everyone touched by Rachel's story, nothing was the same. Meanwhile, the police were already deep into their investigation, and the urgency was overwhelming. There was something about the crime, its violence, its randomness that chilled detectives to their core. This didn't feel like a personal attack. It didn't feel like something driven by jealousy or revenge. It felt stranger, calculated, predatory. A man with a knife, hiding in the bushes, waiting for a woman and her child to pass by. That wasn't spontaneous. That was hunting. And worse, he had escaped. No one saw him. No one could describe him. No one even noticed him leave. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. To detectives, it was the kind of case that hinted at something deeper, something darker. These weren't just the marks of a violent man. These were the marks of a serial predator, a potential serial killer, someone who wouldn't stop, someone who might already be planning his next attack. The clock was ticking. Every day that passed without an arrest was another day that this man remained out there watching, hiding, waiting. But again, there was no evidence, nothing concrete. No murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, only fragments of footprint, a few strands of possible DNA too small to test, red paint in a child's hair that could mean anything or nothing. So the police turned their attention to people, witnesses, the public, and Andre, heartbroken but resolute, became the face of the appeal. He appeared on television, trembling but clear. He begged people to come forward. "If you saw anything at all, please say something." And at first, it seemed to work. Hundreds of calls came in. People reported possible sightings. Strange men. Suspicious behavior. A vehicle parked near the woods. A figure walking quickly out of the park that morning. Police followed up on every single one. But nothing stuck. No solid leads. No arrests. Just more uncertainty. And all the while, in the background of this growing storm, there was one person the police couldn't forget. The only true witness to the murder. Alex. But how do you question a 2-year-old? A child who had just lived through the most traumatic experience imaginable. A child whose mind was still forming, whose vocabulary was limited, who couldn't even name the emotions he was feeling, let alone reconstruct a murder. It was a delicate line, ethically, psychologically. They couldn't drag Alex into an interrogation room and grill him like a suspect. They couldn't push him to remember. That would be cruel and dangerous. So, the police worked with child psychologists, experts in trauma. Together they devised a plan, one built on patience, gentleness, and hope. They decided that the best chance they had was to keep Alex in as natural an environment as possible. No bright lights, no cold interview rooms, just home. Wherever he was staying, with toys around him, familiar smells, people he trusted, they would make sure he was comfortable, safe, free to play and speak as he wanted. And hidden in that safe space would be microphones, cameras, not to invade, not to spy, but just in case, if, in the middle of a game or a story, he said something, if he mentioned the man, if he described what happened, anything, even a name, a word, a feeling, something they could use. It was a long shot, but it was the only ethical way forward. And in a case where nearly every lead had dried up, they hoped quietly, desperately, that the smallest voice in the room might still hold the truth. To try and reach Alex to help him, and perhaps help the case, the police turned to someone they hoped could bridge the silence. A child psychologist. They didn't bring him to an office. They didn't sit him under harsh lights or place him in an interview room. Everything was designed to feel natural, soft, and safe. Sometimes the psychologist came to the house. Sometimes Alex and Andre would visit her. The setting was never clinical, it was always familiar. Toys were scattered around. Coloring supplies were placed nearby. Alex was free to draw, to play, to wander, while the psychologist gently tried to connect. She would sit beside him, ask quiet, open-ended questions, and wait. But Alex didn't respond. He didn't open up, not in words. Session after session passed, and he remained withdrawn. His little body was there, But his mind was somewhere else, trying to protect itself from memories too big for a 2-year-old to carry. Sometimes he would bang his toys together, loudly, repeatedly. It became a pattern, a response. When questions came too close to the truth, too close to the pain, he'd start banging, almost like he was trying to drown out the words, trying to silence the reality. The questions weren't harsh. They were simple. Can you tell us what the bad man looked like? Did the bad man say anything to Mummy? But Alex wouldn't answer. He just sat there, crashing toys together, louder and louder. And slowly the sessions stopped being helpful. They became harmful. It was clear that even in this gentle environment, this approach was only causing more distress. It was reopening wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. He wasn't ready. And maybe he wouldn't ever be. Not like that. So the sessions were canceled. It was a blow. The police knew Alex had seen the man who killed his mother. They knew the truth was inside him, locked away somewhere, but it felt impossible to reach, like there was a wall between his tiny voice and the answers they so desperately needed. And on the other side of that wall, gold, clues, a face, a path forward, but they couldn't get to it. There was one moment, the one brief, haunting breakthrough. During one of the final sessions, the psychologist gave Alex crayons and paper and simply asked if he could draw the bad man. For a long time, he didn't respond, but then slowly he began to draw. When he finished the sketch, he picked up another crayon not to color, but to stab. Over and over again, he jabbed at the drawing with the crayon, mimicking stabbing motions. Faster, harder, repeatedly. And then, still holding the crayon not like a pencil, but like a knife, he walked over to Andre and raised it, silently, like he was reenacting something burned into his memory. It was chilling. He remembered more than anyone had realized. He just couldn't speak it. That's when the session stopped. Everyone involved knew they had to protect Alex first, even if it meant letting go of their only eyewitness. The investigation, once again, felt stalled. But then, something shifted. One day, Andre was driving Alex home from one of those exhausting therapy sessions. Alex was in the back seat, flipping through a children's book, not really reading, just looking at the pictures, pointing, murmuring. And suddenly, he said something. "Fat man, fat man." Andre heard it. He looked at Alex in the rearview mirror, and for the first time he saw something. Not trauma, not withdrawal, but recognition. It was so simple. But it was something. It meant Alex could distinguish between people, between types of people. Andre pulled the car over as soon as they got home. He grabbed paper and a pen and started drawing crude stick figures in pairs. One fat man, one thin man. "Which one looked like the man who hurt Mummy?" he asked. Alex pointed to the thin man. Andre drew more. Tall man, short man, long hair, short hair, beard, no beard, big nose, small nose. And Alex pointed, again and again. Within minutes, Andre had what teams of experts had failed to gather over weeks. A full physical description from his son, not by force, not by questions, but by a father's instinct and a child's trust. All it had taken was the right language, not through words, but through pictures, through play, through simplicity, through love. It was a breakthrough, and it changed everything. From the simple drawings and quiet questions at the kitchen table, they finally had something. Alex had given a description. He said the man who hurt his mother was a thin white man with short brown hair. On the day of the murder, he was wearing blue trousers, a white button-up shirt, brown shoes, a black bag slung over his shoulder, and, strangely, a belt that he wore over his shirt. Not through the belt loops on his jeans, but across his shirt like a strap or accessory. It wasn't a perfect description. It wasn't enough to make an arrest. But it was something. The clearest thing they had in weeks, a fragile thread to pull. And once again, the media took that thread and twisted it. News broke quickly. 2 year. Old son helps solve his mother's murder. And just like that, The media storm, already reckless, exploded into something far more invasive, far more dangerous. Paparazzi followed Alex everywhere. From his grandparents' house to his psychologist sessions, from the hospital to home. They waited outside buildings. They hid behind trees. They tracked the movements of a 3-year-old boy who had just lost his mother in the most horrific way imaginable. There was one day Andre would never forget. He and Alex went to Wimbledon Common, not for answers, not for attention, but to leave a single rose. A quiet tribute, a way to say goodbye. It was meant to be a sacred moment, but the press followed them. Again. Photographers, grown adults, climbed the fences that police had tried to tape off. Officers shouted at them to stay out, to show some respect, but it didn't matter. They ran across the field, over to the very spot where Rachel had died, hoping to snap a shot of the grieving boyfriend and the little boy who had seen it all. Andre, horrified, did the only thing he could do. He took off his own hat and pulled it down over Alex's face. Then he picked his son up gently but firmly and carried him away. All because the press wouldn't leave them alone, not even for a moment of mourning. But why were they so obsessed with Alex? Because the narrative had shifted. The headlines weren't really about Rachel anymore. They were about him. The toddler who witnessed the murder. The baby solving a brutal crime. They turned a child's trauma into a front-page spectacle. And then it got worse. One of the largest, most powerful media publications in the UK, a national name, respected and read by millions, did something that still stuns people to this day. They published a full-color photograph of Alex Hanscom, a picture of a 3-year-old boy, the only witness to his mother's murder, a murder whose perpetrator had not yet been caught. And they printed his face. There he was, in a newspaper read across the country, identifiable, recognizable, vulnerable. And that man, the man who had killed Rachel, was still out there. He knew there had been a witness. He knew it was a child. And now, he knew what the boy looked like. That photograph could have changed everything. Because what if the killer saw it? What if he decided that loose ends needed tying? What if he came back? The thought alone, the possibility, was chilling. It wasn't just disrespectful. It wasn't just distasteful. It was dangerous. The media had put a child's life at risk. A child who was already living through unthinkable pain. A child who should have been protected, shielded, guarded at all costs. Instead, his photo was plastered across papers, shared on television screens, and turned into a headline. They didn't care that he was 3 years old. They didn't care that he was grieving. They didn't care that his mother had been ripped away from him right before his eyes. They wanted the story. And Alex? He became the story. By this point in the investigation, the detectives were running on fumes. There was no delicate way to put it. They were stressed, severely. The kind of stress that comes not just from pressure, but from helplessness. They had no weapon, no forensic evidence they could work with, no suspect, no solid lead. Just a 2-year-old boy who had already given the best description he possibly could. And that was it. They'd followed every standard protocol, every obvious line of inquiry. They spoke to Rachel's friends and family, one by one, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, or even the faintest motive, but there was nothing. Everyone they questioned, every person close to Rachel, was ruled out. No red flags, no suspicious behavior, nothing that hinted at secret resentment or conflict. They asked, did Rachel have any enemies? Was there anyone who had a reason to hurt her? The answers were always the same. Number Rachel was deeply loved. She had a kind heart, a peaceful life. People gravitated toward her. There wasn't a single person in her circle who had anything but warmth to say. And to be fair, the police didn't believe this was a personal attack anyway. It didn't feel like it. It didn't look like it. From the beginning, their instincts told them this was random, cold, a predator, not a rival. So they shifted focus. They went through the registry of known sex offenders in the area surrounding Wimbledon Common. One by one, they visited homes, conducted interviews, cross-referenced histories, asked hard questions. Nothing. They expanded the search, looked into past murders, past sexual assaults, anything that had occurred in the vicinity. They combed through years of case files, hoping to find a pattern, a match, a repeat behavior. Still, no connections. No one stood out. No one matched the crime. No one fit the way this murder had unfolded. And so they began to accept what every detective fears, that they were at a dead end, just weeks into the most high-profile murder case the country had seen in years. Then one day, the phone rang. It was a woman. She said she had been on Wimbledon Common the morning Rachel was murdered. She hadn't spoken to police at the time because she had left the park before the area was sealed off. Her name hadn't been recorded. She hadn't been interviewed. But now, after seeing the news, after hearing that police were desperate for witnesses, she realized she might have seen something, and what she described made everyone sit up straighter. She told police she had been walking near the wooded area just before the attack, and she remembered seeing a man, not walking with purpose, not jogging or strolling like most people, just lingering. He was moving aimlessly, hovering around the trees, drifting a few feet this way, then turning back, not going anywhere in particular, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Something about him struck her immediately as odd. He seemed off. She said he looked like he didn't know what he wanted to do, but he was watching, observing. And most striking of all, he kept trying to hide his face. Every time their eyes met, he would drop his gaze, turn away, pull his head down. She had tried to be friendly, just a polite good morning as you do in public spaces, but he refused to engage. He wouldn't even glance at her for more than a second. It felt deliberate, like he didn't want to be seen. She described him as a thin, white man with short brown hair. He looked nervous, shifty, and very much like he didn't want to be noticed. The officers stared at each other as she gave the details. Because of her description? It matched Alex's perfectly. Same build, same hair, same general demeanor. A match not just physically, but in energy. The same unease, the same strangeness, the same presence that made your stomach twist for reasons you couldn't explain. It was the first time the police had real corroboration. Not from trauma, not from memory hidden beneath layers of shock, but from an independent adult witness who had seen something they couldn't forget. And for the first time in weeks, the detectives had a direction. They had a man to look for. At this point in the investigation, having Alex's description now backed by the sighting from an adult witness was the strongest lead they had, but still, it wasn't enough. The description helped narrow the scope. A thin white man, short brown hair, peculiar clothing choices, but that alone wasn't going to solve a murder, especially not a murder like this. The truth was, they had no name, no suspect, no address to knock on, just a sketch in their minds and a feeling in their gut. So the detectives made a decision. They needed help. They reached out to a man who, in the world of UK true crime, was already gaining a reputation for being precise, brilliant, and unsettlingly accurate in understanding the minds of killers. His name was Paul Britton. If you follow UK crime cases, you may have heard of him. Britton was a forensic psychologist and criminal profiler who had worked on several high-profile investigations. He had an ability to walk into a case with no suspects, no motives, and no witnesses and still see something others couldn't. End quote. So the police brought him everything, every photograph, every report. The autopsy, the crime scene layouts, even the interview notes. They laid it all out in front of him. The chaos, the silence, the blood, and asked him, what kind of man would do this? Before we get into what he told them, let's pause for a second to explain what a criminal profile actually is. A criminal profile is a psychological portrait. It's not based on evidence in the physical sense, no fingerprints, no fibers, but on behavior, on choices. The way a murder is committed tells a story. The how often reflects the who. And from that, profilers like Britton can begin to draw conclusions about the killer, what kind of person they are, what they might do next, what motivates them, even what they look like. Of course, it's not an exact science, the police knew that, but in past cases, profiles had often proven eerily accurate, and at this point, any insight was better than none. So Britton began to work. He studied every detail of the crime, the location, the time of day, the brutality of the stabbing, the fact that Rachel had been sexually assaulted, the use of a knife, the way the killer had approached, how he had vanished afterward. From that, Britton built a profile, and what he returned with was startlingly specific. To start, he told them what they already suspected. This wasn't someone Rachel knew. There was no personal motive. It wasn't planned around her specifically. It was opportunistic. The attacker was likely a stranger who had simply waited for the right moment and the right person. He believed the killer was a young male, likely in his mid to late 20s, definitely no older than 30. And most importantly, he probably lived very close to Wimbledon Common. That detail was based on something very practical. If you're planning to attack someone with a knife, especially in such a frenzied way, you have to know what happens next. You're going to be covered in blood. And if you have to travel a long distance afterward across streets, through crowds, onto buses or trains, you increase your chances of being seen, noticed, reported. But this man, he had disappeared without a trace. That suggested he didn't go far, which meant he likely knew that area. He knew where to strike. He knew that particular patch of woods was quiet, especially in the morning. He likely knew that on weekdays, the common was relatively empty. He had waited, hidden, watched, and chosen his moment. So Britton told the police, "Look close. Within a couple of miles of Wimbledon Common, your killer is probably right under your nose." Paul Britton's criminal profile continued to take shape, and with every new layer he added, the image of Rachel Nichols' killer grew more distinct. It was chilling how specific it became. Britton concluded that the killer was almost certainly single. At most, perhaps casually dating someone, but definitely not in a long-term committed relationship. This man wasn't engaged. He wasn't married. He was alone, maybe even chronically alone. He also suggested the man had average intelligence. He likely did fine in school, not top of the class, not failing, just forgettable. Middling, the kind of student who coasted through without drawing attention. Physically, he was probably the same, average. Not strikingly handsome, not particularly unattractive, a man you wouldn't remember if you passed him in a crowd. Ordinary. In terms of personal history, Britton believed the killer hadn't had much success in romantic relationships, likely few, if any, real connections with women. And the ones that did happen probably ended fast, with the pattern of rejection recurring. Why? Britton suspected poor social skills. A man uncomfortable in conversation. Someone who didn't know how to build emotional closeness. Someone who grew up craving intimacy but never learning how to hold it. This man probably lived alone or with his parents, but not with friends. Not with a girlfriend. Not even roommates. His world was likely small, isolated. Quiet in the wrong ways. Britton also believed, and this part was important, that this was the killer's first murder. But it wasn't likely his first crime. He probably had a history of lesser sexual offenses, things like harassment, assault, possibly even public indecency or illegal pornography. The kind of disturbing behavior that might have been reported once or twice, but never taken seriously enough. The profile got even more specific than that. Britton's full report apparently went into pages of traits, patterns, and possible psychological markers, though not all of that is available publicly today. But what police now had was a blueprint. Not a face, not a name, but a pattern. A type. A way to narrow the field. Of course, they knew a profile wasn't perfect. It's not an arrest warrant. It's not DNA. But it gave them something they hadn't had before: direction. Now, when they looked at a potential suspect, they could ask, does this man fit the template? Does he live nearby? Is he isolated? Has he been rejected? Has he shown signs of deviant behavior before? But even with this profile in hand, the truth was impossible to ignore. It had been 2 months since Rachel Nichols was murdered, and they still had no suspect, no arrests, no resolution. And the pressure was rising like a storm. Of course, the police wanted to solve this for Rachel, for Alex, for her family. But it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about fear, about safety, about London. Because if Paul Britton was right, if this was a man who had just committed his first murder, then the second might not be far behind. He had gotten away with it once. And that kind of power, that kind of control, is addictive. They feared the next call, the next body, the next family destroyed. And the media? They weren't helping. They were relentless, critical, suspicious of the entire police force. And, honestly, it was hard to blame them. 2 months had passed. A young mother was dead, her son traumatized. And nothing, at least nothing visible, had changed. No updates, no breakthroughs, no faces on wanted posters, just silence. And in that silence, fear grew. People were terrified. Parents didn't want to take their kids to the park anymore. Women stopped walking alone. Trust in the police began to waver. The press kept pushing partly out of public concern. But also, let's be honest, because they had nothing to print. The story was going stale. And in the world of tabloids, justice delayed wasn't just justice denied, it was bad copy. And the officers working the case, they felt it too. The weight of failure, the burden of helplessness, the knowledge that somewhere, out there, the man who did this was still walking free. Then, finally, in September 1992, the case moved forward. For the first time in weeks, police had something new, not a memory, not a theory, but a face. Well, the beginning of one. It came from witnesses. The first was the woman who had called in weeks earlier, the one who had seen a man acting strangely on Wimbledon Common just before the murder, pacing through the trees, lurking in the shadows, and trying, deliberately, to hide his face. She came in. She sat down with a sketch artist, described every detail she could remember, the hair, the build, the clothing, the oddness in his movements. But she wasn't the only one. Another woman, who had remained silent until now, also came forward. She, too, had been on the Common that morning. She hadn't thought what she saw was important at first, just a man by a stream, washing his hands. But after seeing news coverage of the case, she started to piece the timeline together, and something clicked. What she had witnessed likely happened right after Rachel Nicholl was killed. A man alone, quiet, dipping his hands into the stream, cleaning something, looking calm. So she called police. And like the first witness, she offered to help. Together, the two women sat down and worked with investigators to create a composite sketch. The result? A face. Rough, simple, but recognizably human. It wasn't a perfect portrait. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was enough. Enough for the public to look at and say, "I've seen that man before." The sketch was shared with the media. And more importantly, it was broadcast on a show called Crime Watch. For those who don't know, Crime Watch was a weekly television program in the UK that featured real, unsolved cases. Each episode would highlight current investigations, asking viewers for help, sharing police tip lines, and sometimes even reenactments of the crime itself. It was incredibly popular. Nearly everyone watched it. And now, Rachel Nicholl's case had its own segment. The sketch was shown on national television. A narrator described the scene, the time, the location, the suspicious behavior. And then the face appeared on screen, the composite drawing, the man in the woods, the man by the stream, and suddenly, the phone lines exploded. The police received dozens of calls, then hundreds. People across the country were calling in, saying they recognized the sketch. They had seen that man. Some thought he lived nearby. Others thought he worked in a particular shop, or rode the same bus, or walked through the same park. The leads poured in, and among all those names, scattered, varied, inconsistent, there was one name that came up again and again and again. Over and over, people pointed to the same man, a familiar figure. Someone they remembered. Someone who, when they saw that sketch, made them sit up and say, "That looks just like him." And just like that, the police had a name. It wasn't proof, but it was a beginning. And in an investigation that had felt hopeless for so long, that beginning meant everything.